Hi Church family. So this evening we get to look at everybody's favourite topic to discuss in a group setting, which is temptations and the temptations we all face. And specifically looking at it through the lens of Jesus and how he engages emotionally with just the reality of temptation that even he experienced. And what I really want to do actually is to start reading and just read through the passage together from verse 27 all the way through to the end of verse 42. And just as we go through, I'm going to stop at certain points and just tease out two ways in which Jesus is contrasted with Peter in how they respond to temptation. And I think Peter really shows us how we naturally respond to temptation, and Jesus is a really encouraging example of how we can respond differently and in a more engaged way. So without any more preamble, let's jump in. So reading from verse 27, Mark chapter 14. Jesus predicts Peter's denial. "You will all fall away," Jesus told them, "for it is written, 'I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered.' But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Peter declared, "Even if all fall away, I will not." "Truly I tell you," Jesus answered, "today, yes, tonight, before the cock crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times. But Peter insisted emphatically, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the others said the same. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said. "Stay here and keep watch." So just pause there a second. Just 2 really distinct ways in which Peter and Jesus respond to temptation. Jesus announces to Peter that he is going to fail, that he is going to succumb to temptation. Now we look at temptation as, you can look at it in a lot of different ways, but most simply put, it's the natural pull and desire within us to depart from what God wants and to choose something different, whether that be to avoid a painful experience or whether that be to pursue a certain kind of pleasure. Whatever the motivation is, temptation is fundamentally the pull within us to walk away from what God wants. And Jesus announces to his disciples what God is going to do, that Jesus is going to be struck, that the sheep will be scattered, and then he talks about even the resurrection coming afterwards and going ahead into Galilee. So Jesus has a very clear picture of what God is going to do and what's going to happen. But Peter's response to that is to say, "Surely not me. I will never fail like that, Jesus. I love you too much. I'm too committed to you. I'm not that kind of person. I'm not the person to be tempted and fail in that kind of way." Now let's contrast that with the way that Jesus responds to temptation. So after that, they go to the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus, after having just announced that he's going to be struck, and even in the context of knowing that he's going to rise and that he's going to go ahead of the disciples into Galilee after the resurrection, and having a revelation, a clear conviction, understanding of what is going to happen, he still begins to be very heavily troubled. So it says he becomes deeply distressed and troubled, and the way that he describes his emotional experience as being overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. And the way I understand that is that Jesus is feeling the burden and the weight of what is about to happen to him. And he's feeling every fiber of his being saying, "Run, get away, don't go through that suffering, don't endure that suffering. I don't want to suffer like that." And that is so troubling and distressing that it is overwhelming to him. And the key difference I think that can be useful for us here in terms of engaging with temptation, and something that I'm pretty bad at, but I want to get better at, is that while Peter can't face the idea that he's the kind of person who would abandon Jesus, Jesus is fully emotionally engaged with the reality that he is tempted to run away and to avoid suffering, to walk away from what God has planned and prepared from time immemorial to achieve for our salvation. Even with the context of knowing the resurrection, he still emotionally experiences the temptation and the weight and the pressure of all that suffering that's about to come upon him, and that there's an acknowledgement in him of that that burden and that pull and that weight. So on the one hand, we have Peter unable to recognize his own weakness. And on the other hand, you have Jesus very much emotionally connected and in touch with his own weakness in the face of what God is calling him to do. So let's just continue reading on. From verse 35, it says, Jesus now, going a little farther, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Simon, he said to Peter, are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping, because their eyes were heavy. They did not know what to say to him. Returning the third time, he said to them, are you still sleeping and resting? Enough! The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer. So, again, contrasting Jesus and Peter. What Jesus does with this burden, this awareness of the temptation that he's facing, is an emotional full engagement with his own human frailty and weakness and temptation, is to bring that honestly before the Lord. To say, the first thing he declares is the character of God. He goes, Abba, Father, you are my Father. There's a person like that acknowledgement, understanding of his relationship with the Father. In the context of God's goodness and fatherhood, he acknowledges God's power. Everything is possible for you. There is nothing that is not possible. Then he acknowledges his desire before God. Take this cup from me. You know, sometimes temptation can be towards a sin, which is obviously wrong. And sometimes temptation can even be to avoid a negative experience out of fear. It can be, think of Moses, God calling Moses to lead his people out of Egypt. And Moses' response is basically, just send someone else. I can't do this. I'm not up to the task. But Jesus' confidence and his ability to engage with God in the moment of his temptation is not rooted in his understanding of his own strength or his own ability, but is rooted in the goodness and the power of God and his freeness is the freedom he has to declare how he's feeling and what he asks from God. Please take this experience away from me. Please don't let me go through this suffering. Yet, and finally, not what I will, but what you will. So there's a final acknowledgement that I don't want this, but God, if you want it, I trust that it's good. So again, I think that a lot of this is very much related to the temptations that we face when we go through suffering and trials and difficulty. To acknowledge, I don't want this thing, but if you want it, Lord, then I trust that you will bring something good out of it. Contrast that now with Peter. So Peter has heard the way that he's going to fail. He's responded emphatically that that's not who he is. That's not how he is as a person. That he has an inability to emotionally connect or to receive. Even Jesus telling him plainly, you are going to abandon me. He has no ability to receive that in and of himself. And the result in that is that, I imagine Peter and the other two disciples could probably hear what Jesus was praying. It says that Jesus went a little further than them and then started praying out loud, Abba, Father, take this cup from me. And and they can hear like the distress in Jesus' voice, and still their eyes are heavy and they fall asleep. And 3 times Jesus comes back to wake them up out of sleep and out of this disengagement. And what I'm saying is that while Peter did not engage with the emotional reality of his temptation and bring it, that he therefore did not bring that temptation before God, and therefore he succumbed to sleep, and he was not as alive to the reality of what was going on as Jesus was. And the final result of that is that he was fundamentally like not at all prepared for what happened. When Jesus returned the 3rd time, the time has come, the moment of trial, of temptation. There's no more preparing your heart before the Lord that's available to Peter or the other disciples. They're rolling down the hill now into that experience, and into the situation where they are going to fail. They are going to succumb to temptation, the temptation to preserve their own life and run away from Jesus and abandon him. And I guess just to kind of wrap it all up, I think what we can really learn from Jesus about how to engage with our temptation is really clearly stated in his words to Peter when he refers to him as Simon. Watch and pray that you do not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And it is no bad thing for us to be able to acknowledge the weakness of our flesh, and to own and acknowledge and engage with the emotions we experience when we feel that tug and that pull to depart from the way that God has set for us. Whether that be a temptation to go into sin because we're pursuing, for example, like a sense of intimacy or closeness, or because we fear lack and we fear struggle and strife, so we succumb to greed and the desire for more riches. Whatever it is, whatever temptation we face, being able to acknowledge our weakness is the first step to being able to engage with that temptation in an emotionally honest way, in the way that Jesus does with his temptation in the garden. So I hope that's given you some food for thought. I pray that the Lord blesses you in your discussions as your groups this evening, that if people need to share particular struggles they're going through, they can feel the freedom to do that, and that your conversation, may the Lord bless your conversations, that they may be edifying, and may you be strengthened to be emotionally vulnerable and honest before the Lord in your trials and in your temptations. Bless you.